Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining NASCA this afternoon. We'll give everyone just a moment to log in. As you're doing that, please make sure you hover over your name to the right, rename yourself so that we know who's joining us today. Please list your name and your company or your state so that everyone on the call will have a chance to see who has joined us today. Again, welcome. We're excited about today's conversation. This is another edition in our top 10 priorities for state chief administrators webinar series. Today, we're talking about supply chain and stockpile management, talking about how the pandemic response has really shifted those state government models. Got a great conversation group to talk today, sharing a little bit about what's happening in several states and also from the private sector as well. We're excited about the conversation. Again, make sure that you drop your name in with Zoom. Also drop your LinkedIn information into the chat. We'd love to connect with you as well. I'm Pam Goins, Executive Director at NASCA, and we are again excited to have you with us this afternoon to talk about this conversation around stockpiles and supply chain management. When NASCA does our top 10, I can be honest and say this was not something we had ever expected to see in a top 10 list of priorities for our state chief administrators, thinking about PPE and stockpiling for the future. But it's very, very evident that it's critically a conversation that we must have. And over the last 19 months, it's only really escalated. There was definitely some challenges at the beginning of the pandemic, but not all that has gone away. And what we're seeing again is that there's been a shift and a change and really a revitalization of supply chain management systems and models. And we're excited today to talk about that and share a little bit about what's happening in the states. As everyone continues to get logged in, we do want to kind of take a temperature check of what's happening with you, our attendees today. And so we've got a couple of polls that we'd love for you to respond to. So Tammy, if you don't mind, would you bring up our first poll? And we'll just kind of see what's happening with our audience today. So our first poll, initially, what was the most significant impact from the global health pandemic regarding supply chain management? Check off one of these. Was it that you couldn't get the goods and services as quickly as you had hoped? That the state model of safe and secure decision-making had to be interrupted or adapted? Or was it more about the public perception about those goods and services being purchased? So take just a moment again and respond to that first poll question. We're talking initially, as we were just getting into the pandemic, we knew this was not going to go away overnight or even within the next month or two. What was that initial and most significant impact on your supply chain management? We'll give you just another moment to respond to that. We definitely have one that's leading the way. Tammy, will you go ahead and show us the results of this first poll here? You may not be surprised to say 80% of you said that the ability to acquire goods and services as quickly as you needed to was the most significant impact. All right, how about our second poll question? Get that pulled up here for us so we can take a look. Poll question number 2. As we continue to what we're hoping is an emerging opportunity from COVID-19 and the pandemic, what lasting effects might be seen as positive in your state? And here you can select all that apply to you. Is it that your response planning and scenario building is more robust, that processes and protocols have been streamlined, data has been elevated in the decision-making process, and or enterprise-wide communication has increased? And again, you certainly can select more than one of these when you're looking at what's going to stick. What might we see continue on into the future? Interesting results here that we're seeing already. Give you just 3 more seconds to respond to this second poll question. All right, Tammy, let's see what these results are showing us. Interesting. So 70% both said response planning and scenario building is more robust and the communication has increased. It's fantastic. 60% are saying that the processes and protocols have been streamlined, and 30% are looking at the elevated data as far as decision making. So very, very interesting, important, and we appreciate you responding to those polls with us today. So again, today we're going to talk about those emerging practices in the states around supply chain management, really looking at some of the innovation that's happening around the country, as well as some vulnerabilities and really maybe some of those challenges that continue to remain. We have three amazing panelists with us today, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to have a conversation with them. You'll see Kurt Topper, who is the Chief Administrative Officer from Pennsylvania, also a member of the NASCA Executive Committee. Dustin Lanier, who is the founder of Civic Initiatives and former CPO. And then also Jamie Shore, who is the Chief Procurement Officer in Maine. And I'm so excited to have all of you all with us here today. Again, to share a little bit about what you're seeing and where we're headed with supply chain management in these new models. So thank you all for joining us, and let's just dig right into some of our conversation today. So let me start with a conversation question to all three of you all as we kick off today's conversation and really set the stage for the remainder of our time together here today. First and foremost, for those on the call, how would you define supply chain management, and how have you potentially seen a shift in that due to the pandemic? Kurt, let me start with you, then off to Jamie and Dustin.
How would I define supply chain management? Well, I think broadly, right, it's all of the processes, procedures, and people, systems that are involved in making sure that our agencies here in the Commonwealth have what they need when they need it. I think that's probably the best way I would describe it. And that means being responsive to a changing environment, which is probably the biggest lesson of the last 18 months. And we'll talk about that more.
Absolutely. Jamie, your thoughts on the definition, maybe things that have changed in the state of Maine?
Pre-pandemic, I would have said it is a series of systems put in place to adequately provide the appropriate goods and services needed for anything, right? During the pandemic, I would probably define it as the wild, wild west gone bad, right? Those first few months, it was nuts, and it was every state for themselves, every locality for themselves, just try to keep your head above water. And we can touch on more of it, I think, as the conversation goes on. But Pam, I think it's important that we think about the history of the supply chain model and how it came about. So just quickly, right, thinking back to the 1970s, where we had federal policies that were put in place that favored private equity financiers and monopolists, we simply weren't prepared to manage a supply shock such as the COVID-19 pandemic. We had a dangerous over-reliance on products that are and continue to be manufactured elsewhere. And I'll just give one quick example, right? The 1997 Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which led to a merger wage, whereby if you think back to the industry that's now consolidated into 3 alliances and had the ship that crashed into the Suez Canal, it was like a perfect storm in the middle of COVID. And our ability as state agencies to respond to that perfect storm required agile thinking with antiquated processes. And now we start thinking ahead to the future. So I'll pause there as I'm eager to hear Dustin's comments on supply chain.
So Dustin, you're really coming from a little bit different lens from the private sector and working in the public sector with many of the states on their processes. So how would you respond to that initial question?
Well, it's a process of taking goods and services from their most raw state through the point at which they're able to do work, and then the processes that we have to take to acquire it and receive it and put it to work. And, to not repeat things that have been said, but maybe try to add a different tilt to the conversation, I would say that procurement shops and purchasing shops, by and large, pre-pandemic, could probably assume that if they placed an order, they would receive an order. If they bought a good, they'd receive a good. And I think that probably one of the major impacts on procurement in the phase, and I think that will have a lasting impact on interest on supply chain issues, is the addition of logistics to core expectation or responsibility for purchasing. I've told the story before, so you excuse me for using cliches, but that's why you use them, because they're good, right? So one of the procurement officers that we work with, when I was talking to her early in the process, she said, how many pallets does 6 million surgical gloves take up? And I said, I have no idea. And she said, neither do I. And the answer is like 120, right? And so now it's not just placing the order, but then the logistics of actually chasing it and receiving it. Gary Lambert, who's on the call, had a great story when we did a panel with him a few quarters ago, talking to people when the goods are literally being put on airplanes in China and then having to try to keep them from being taken off the airplanes, up to, if we receive the goods, where do we put them, right? We purchased 120 pallets of surgical gloves. Where are those going to go, and how are they going to get around? So it's not that those weren't responsibilities of administrative shops before, but I think it really sharpened and focused the fact that that's a core responsibility of our teams that are dealing with that kind of a supply.
And as maybe a quick follow-up to that, I think part of that conversation also is not only how much do we need, how much space does it take, how long do we keep it? What is that shelf life? And then how do we track that across the board? So maybe as a quick follow-up to both Kurt and Jamie, how did you have to shift your tracking systems when you're thinking about, and we're talking purely PPE at this point, the longevity, and what does that mean for the state?
So I think at the beginning of the pandemic, Pam, I don't think that our systems were adequate to do anything like what you're describing. We didn't. We had to shift very quickly from a world where we could order something like we could order PPE and have it delivered to the site where it was needed within a reasonable period of time, and we never really had to have significant on-hand inventory. We moved from there to a world where we had a little bit of control over what was being ordered, no control over when it would arrive, and we were ordering it in massive quantities. So we had to prepare a makeshift warehouse for it, and we had to build systems on the fly in order to be able to track inventory. Honestly, at the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't worry so much about shelf life or expiration, except insofar as we were worried about receiving expired goods. I think the real challenge that gets data intensive comes later, once you're working on building a stockpile and trying to figure out how you're going to manage and replenish a stockpile going forward, which has sort of been our challenge in PA since once we got through the initial phase.
Jamie, thoughts on that?
Oh, to not ever have to relive those early days of the pandemic of buying PPE would be a longtime dream of mine. Wow, what a challenge. And I resonate with the words that Kurt said when we just simply weren't prepared. We didn't have enough items on hand. Those days of maintaining a central warehouse and central purchasing and having thousands and thousands of square feet of pens, pencils, masks, sanitizer, all that stuff on hand, those days that went away 15, 20 years ago, right? So as Kurt mentioned, we're in the early throes of the pandemic, and CPOs are not only being asked to buy items that we can't control the delivery date, we can't control the pricing. We have fraudulent vendors coming out of the woodwork, where now we're trying to vet the vendor, we're trying to vet the product, we're trying not to lose the money, and yet we're trying to keep people safe, all while taking our workforce and being at home, some of whom truly did not have internet access at home. And I know that that seems a little bit strange to think about, but in my background picture, there's no internet towers hanging out in the middle of that mountain, right? And that's what 75% of Maine is, probably not significantly different from areas of Pennsylvania, right? So we start, as we're going through the pandemic, NASPO, I have to give credit to NASPO. They released a study not so long ago on the COVID-19 pandemic, and the report specifically focused on PPE shortages that occurred throughout the US in 2020. And the results of this report ultimately demonstrated that by utilizing a central governance model, a central procurement model, we were able to more effectively respond to the large-scale supply chain disruptions. And in those situations where it was less centralized, they didn't have the ability to coordinate, they didn't have the ability to provide efficient application of their contracting expertise. So truly, I go back to the words at the beginning that I mentioned, it felt even more like the wild, wild west than if we were in a centralized procurement arena.
Definitely. So Jamie, let me stay with you here just for a moment and maybe take a little bit different spin on the conversation. We know that government exists to serve the people, but in your role as a CPO, how do you work on a daily basis to ensure that your processes and your models and systems do actually integrate or interface with the citizens and your constituents?
I love this question, right? Because there's all of us sitting here behind our cameras and we're talking to, I don't know, we could be talking to 30 million people and we have no idea the impact of the words coming out of our mouth. That is not different than what we do every day as public servants. What we do and the decisions we make affect all of our customers, our constituents, their children. There's a very humanistic approach to all of public service. And so in our world, we have a goal of trying to create this dynamically resilient, data-driven supply chain network, right? That sounds awesome. Let me just repeat that, right? Dynamically resilient, data-driven supply chain network. That's like the Cadillac model of what we do every day. It doesn't mean anything more than our ability to quickly detect, respond, and recover from changes in the marketplace. And so let's think about some of the like real life examples that we are experiencing every day, right? We all know about toilet paper. It's just been a thing. It's there, it's not there. What about the pipettes and the petri dishes in the medical labs, or paint, electronics for automobiles, the production of those high-end chips that mostly reside in East Asia, right? We can't get those chips. Taiwan Semiconductor holds a near monopoly. So Kurt, if you need to replace your fleet, guess what? You can't do it. Or how about another real life story? You can't get a Whopper meal at a Burger King in Florida because there's no French fries. They have no potatoes. These are real life stories that as procurement officials and administrators, we can affect how our farmers are producing crops. We can affect how the marketplace is producing locally domestic manufactured goods. So all of that, Pam, to answer your question, to say, we are asking CPOs and administrators to look more and more to those vendor relationships, have the conversations with your existing vendors rather than trying to find new vendors, build your relationships and build up the manufacturing that's all around us, just so we can respond to those unexpected global pandemics or, I don't know, random ice storms in Texas, for example.
Exactly. And I think we so often think about some of those more emergent crises that are happening. Again, who would have thought we would be 19 months into a global health pandemic, but we don't always take it down to the humanistic level. So I appreciate you touching on that, Jamie. So Dustin, let me flip over to you. You're the founder of a company that works directly with states about this every single day. What are some of the changes that you have seen? And I will say to our group, Dustin and I were chatting the other day, and he brought up the concept of force majeure. Well, I think about force majeure when we're talking about hotel contracts, not about supply chain. So Dustin, what are you seeing happening in the States?
Well, I mean, obviously, for this conversation to be relevant to today, it can't just be purely talking about the pandemic. It's more kind of what factors have, where have things moved to now, right? Certain things have stabilized, and then new issues are coming up. And on the force majeure thing, I had said that I'd had 2 or 3 different folks ask me about what people were doing as far as including the concept that the pandemic is no longer an excuse for acts of God, right? Or how do we deal with other kind of acts of God? I put together 2 or 3 things that I was planning on referencing today onto a URL that I'll put in the chat. One of them was a link to the Wall Street Journal had an article about how the question about how does the coming out of COVID-19, but still the lingering effects, and then Jamie put well the lingering or emerging supply chain effects. How does that work back into contracting? At what point do we say that certain things are or are not allowable as claims on why things can't be met? And so it always attracts my attention when the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post actually write about supply chain issues. I get a lot of my supply chain news from Rob Hanfield, who was participating in the study that was done for Jamie. He had a thing that was up recently that was basically pointing to a lot of the supply chain gaps that are happening now, which as manufacturing has moved to other things or parts of the world that where some of these, like the chips and so forth that she mentioned, reside. There are long and lingering effects of some of the supply chain on the way that contracting happens. So I'm interested in how contracting changes now that we're in this phase. So, I mean, I know Jamie chimed in on it. I don't know if Kurt is dealing with any questions around, are you seeing any changes in contracting now? Are you guys picking up the force majeure kind of question as well? You're on mute, Kurt. If I stumped you, that was my bad, but I didn't know if you're seeing any of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really appreciate, Dustin, that you want to make this relevant to right now, right? Because I'm with you, Jamie. I don't necessarily want to relive those early months, right? We are struggling, I think, to some degree to return to normal. Part of it is, we were blessed in Pennsylvania that we have a procurement code that provided sufficient flexibility for us to be able to respond to things that we needed to respond to. But the challenge now on some level is putting the genie back in the bottle. So when, the one nice thing about doing procurement on an emergency basis is that you can move quickly. You can ignore a whole bunch of procedures and regulations in order to get what you need in a timely way. And that, believe it or not, is a popular approach with many of our customers. And so now part of the challenge, I think, is returning to a normal footing, or gradually returning to a normal footing, so that we can ensure that the requirements of the code are met, ensure that we have small and diverse business participation in our contracts, those kinds of things. And so I think we're wrestling with that now. It's requiring a ton of communication between our teams and the agencies that we serve. And we have a genuine desire to take the lessons that we've learned about, oh yeah, okay, we can move really fast. That's really good to know. Let's take that mindset back into a normal course of business and see where we can apply it, see where we can preserve it. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Dustin, but those were the thoughts that came to mind as I was listening to you. I think our big current challenge is that's definitely one of them. It's returning to normal, but at the same time figuring out how to preserve some of the speed that we developed, and not disappointing our customers who would rather ignore certain steps and regulations.
Kurt, I have to chuckle a little bit when you were talking about emergency procurements are favored by our customers. Well, yeah, of course it's favored. You get to pick whoever you want for whatever price you want to, because we are in an emergency. And I will attribute Governor Mills and Commissioner Kirsten Figueroa, my commissioner, who sort of coined the phrase, just because we're in an emergency does not mean that everything is an emergency, right? So when I, as a chief procurement officer, I start to get a little bit of anxiety when I hear people saying, we need this, we don't have time for competitive procurement, we don't have time to follow the process. And under some antiquated processes, I would tend to agree with you. However, with a quality CPO, as I would say 50 states and the District of Columbia have, they have incredible innovation. They have incredible ideas about how to effectively spend taxpayer dollars in an emergency that does not require a sole source. So I absolutely hear you. I appreciate you. And I appreciate those comments. And it really resonated when early enough in the pandemic, many of the chief administrators from the states came to their CPOs and said, this is an emergency. What do we do? How do we buy this? How do we respond? So I think that collaboration between the two groups is what made the states so successful in being able to respond to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent points. So then let's take a step back just a little. We don't want to relive 19 months for sure, but I'm going to anticipate that we've learned a lot in the last 19 months. We've seen that there are efficiencies. We've seen that there are new ways of looking at processes, systems, planning. So Jamie, what's some of the top things that you've learned there in Maine as far as creating those new efficient processes?
Sleep is overrated, right? So just stop sleeping, and then we can call China all the time and get what we need for products. I say that somewhat joking, but somewhat in seriousness, because that is exactly what we had to do early on, right? We get 4 hours of sleep, we wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we make calls to vendors over in China. But to a more serious side, Pam, we have started to realize that, as Kurt mentioned, that on-hand supply is not effective when we have unexpected emergencies. So now we're looking at more of an end-to-end data-driven supply chain control, where we're, as Dustin mentioned, we're looking at building contracts that focus on transparency into where the raw materials come from, where they are in the supply chain process, to following the raw materials through to the semi-finished goods, all the way through to the finished products. And ultimately, our contracts are allowing us to see into the suppliers, and to our customers, right? It's really an end-to-end process. I think the other point that I would make is that we're now learning that we have to prepare for the disruption before the disruption. So we're creating redundancies in our supply chain process, whereby we have emergency stockpiles, we have safety stocks in various places, whether it's local, offshore, reshore, wherever it may be. And we also have diversified sourcing. So our suppliers that are looking to do business with our state now must be able to provide additional surge capacity in the event of disruption. One of the biggest challenges that I think we have in creating this model and sort of overhauling our contracts is focusing on the resources that go with the vendors. People and employment are scarce, and finding the appropriate talent at the appropriate stage is also very difficult, kind of bringing in that human element again. The talent, the people, the manufacturing, the infrastructure, it all has to be there. But I am very positive in small businesses that are local and working with the states, and even at a federal level, right? Small businesses responded to the pandemic in such an incredible way. So really focusing on having those public-private conversations at a small business level, that's part of our ongoing response to recreating our supply chain in Maine.
Kurt, any thoughts from the state of Pennsylvania?
Thoughts about
Some of those more lasting efficiencies that you've seen, that you've learned, new ways of doing things.
Yeah, well, I think that, the biggest, the biggest lesson, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say it right, but the biggest lesson by far for me was that folks like Jamie and your counterparts here in Pennsylvania, Ken Hess and Janice Pister and their entire team, you guys are heroes, right? You were unsung heroes before the pandemic. And there's no question that you behaved really heroically throughout those, especially those early times in the pandemic. When you think about what you all had to do to respond to that challenge, while figuring out how to telework, which was something we'd never done, and you had, and folks without internet, all that stuff. Figuring out how to shift your perspective from being someone who places orders to someone who has to go aggressively out into the marketplace and compete for scarce commodities. Doing things you'd never had to do before, going out, connecting directly with brokers and directly with manufacturers if you could overseas. That's something state governments historically wouldn't really have thought too much about, at least certainly not here in Pennsylvania. And our team figured out how to do that overnight, and they did it extraordinarily well. I think our mindset has changed with respect to risk taking as a consequence. We're a lot less risk averse, or we've realized that we can be a lot less risk averse when we need to be. So for prior to the pandemic, I don't think the Commonwealth had ever paid in advance for anything. And suddenly we were making upfront payments in order to guarantee shipments of materials coming in from overseas. That was a pretty extraordinary change for, our legal team had to be working around the clock at the same time in order for us to be able to negotiate terms. I think, again, the challenge right now is figuring out how to preserve all of that, all those lessons that we learned, and bring all of that newfound flexibility to bear on serving customers, because it's what they want from us. At the same time that we sort of return to a non-emergency footing and ensure that we have adequate competition and all those good things. I think the bigger, longer term thing for us is, just like Jamie mentioned, stockpiling. Before the pandemic, inventory was a cost, right? That's what inventory equals stranded cost. And now our whole mindset around that has changed. We went through just like you did probably in Maine, Jamie, 20 years ago, we eliminated tons of warehouse space and we stopped centrally storing all of this stuff. And then all of a sudden now we're really reevaluating that. So I've got 500,000 square feet worth of PPE on hand right now. And now the trick is figuring out, how do we keep that stockpile fresh? How do we rotate it and use it? and how do we, sort of maintain it cost effectively, so that it's there when we need it the next time. And so we've had to kind of shift our whole mindset, because we weren't thinking about those things prior to the pandemic.
Definitely.
And Pam, can I just add to that quickly before you go back to Dustin? Kurt, you brought up a really good point that now we have all these warehouses and we have this, millions and millions of dollars of PPE. One of the challenges that we're facing right now is some expiration dates on some of our hand sanitizer, for example. And now we're looking for vendors to either maintain this hazardous waste or destroy it in some sort of way that's not going to be harmful to the environment, or figure out ways to use it. I truly cannot give away the hand sanitizer. We are saturated with Tito's vodka hand sanitizer, what have you, right? But I also wanted to mention another example as you were talking about heroes. One, I appreciate that you said that, because before the pandemic, I think same thing with chief administrators, right? We keep the trains running on time. The only time we're ever in the paper is if the trains stop running. And that's similar with procurement officers. And I noticed that David Yarkin, former CPO of Pennsylvania, has joined us. I want to give a tribute to David, who put up a post on LinkedIn a month or two ago, whereby he said, if you think about Hurricane Katrina 16 years ago, there was some widespread flooding, right? The levees didn't hold. Whereas Hurricane Ida, just a month ago, the levees held. So what was the difference? The difference was public procurement that had the profound impact on these citizens in Louisiana. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers spent $14 billion to build intricate systems of levees, floodgates, and pumps. It was built by engineer marvels who were picked by who? The procurement staff at the Corps of Engineers, right? So the heroic work by these underappreciated public purchasing teams, and the teams are not just the CPOs, it's a collaborative effort between their administrators and the CPOs. They literally saved a great American city and its 400,000 residents. Incredible. So the work that has happened between administrators and procurement officials, it could not be more central to what is happening right now in the world with supply chain.
So Dustin, you have perhaps a little different lens where you're, again, working with the states. You have a much broader perspective, I think, on the variety of different strategies and efficiencies that you may have seen. Anything you'd like to add to what we've already heard from Kurt and Jamie on some of those new ways or new lessons learned?
Well, I'll just sort of preemptively pick up a future question, because Jamie talked about purchasing in an emergency doesn't mean every purchase justifies being an emergency. As purchasing and to some degree still is allowed to operate under the COVID era procurement period. A couple of things. One is I wrote an article early in the COVID process that talked about 3 things to be doing now to be prepared for FEMA reimbursement requests. So while it was somewhat narrowly focused on FEMA, the topic is still relevant, right? Which is Jamie's point that just because the rules are relaxed doesn't mean there's no rules. There are still things that the feds expect to be done under a procurement process, even under an emergency. And if you engage in an emergency procurement, you still need to be prepared to do a competitive procurement as quickly as possible. Trying to talk about how that lesson carries forward into now, as ARPA funding comes, it's going to be highly scrutinized. And we've had several conversations with procurement shops that both are dealing with a surge of anticipated procurements that all have very specific deadlines, and a need to remember all the characteristics of what it means to be purchasing in a way that is going to meet these expectations, regardless of whether we're still allowed to purchase in an emergency setting or not. So if the phrase 2 CFR 200 doesn't roll off your lips as chief administrators or procurement officers, it probably should, or it certainly should from the person who's right under you, because that's where a lot of these kind of concepts live of what are the minimum core expectations of good procurement. Don't buy from debarred vendors, check sam.gov for, to confirm that, execute in a way that is competitive. Don't accept fixed price plus kind of solicitations. I mean, there are very specific rules of what's in there. And, as one characteristic, I guess, of COVID that made COVID really unique was it hit everywhere at the same, it impacted everywhere at the same time, whether the places were experienced in dealing with an emergency or not. So, the Floridas and Louisianas and Texases, which had dealt with a lot of emergencies, maybe places in the Great Plains or in the Midwest who weren't exposed to that kind of an environment, still had to deal the same way. ARPA has a similar characteristic in the sense that it's going to create a lot of impact across a lot of these shops, whether they're used to having that level of money or not. And so I think learning and trying to say, how do we make sure that we keep the principles of managing the supply chain and carry them forward into good supply chain management? It's time to make sure that we remember and have refreshed those characteristics and taken away the perception that we are in an emergency procurement phase, and reapplying those lessons into what will be in many cases a surge of new projects and new procurements coming out of procurement shops across the country.
Mhm.
So Dustin, you mentioned ARPA funds, and for the first time this week, I spoke with a state who said, we're out of money. Generally, everyone else is saying, we're trying to find a way to this money. And certainly looking at a variety of different methods and approaches to be responsible.
Uh-oh.
ARPA's I'll jump in, Dustin, if I can, on ARPA,
Yeah.
because I think it's a very relevant topic, certainly focused on supporting the economic recovery from the pandemic. But I think it's a good conversation. What do you do? How do you spend it? Kurt, I don't know, in Pennsylvania, maybe you guys have come up with an immediate plan to spend everything, but we're still, we have buckets of money and we're working on spending it. How quickly is Pennsylvania going to be able to spend down this money?
Well, so a lot of that depends on, the ongoing work with our General Assembly. So, we have requirements there around the money getting appropriated before we can spend it. And so it's an ongoing, that's an ongoing conversation. There are portions of the money that can be spent outright, and there are portions of the money that are subject to a negotiation. I will say that it's an odd experience after 6+ years of austerity kinds of budgets, to be coming into a year for a change where we actually have some resources to do some things, and that's been a sort of an odd silver lining to all of this I think from a Pennsylvania state government perspective. That doesn't mean we're flush with cash, but it does mean that we're able to invest in some key systems that we might not have been able to invest in. So, we've been spending a lot of time looking for one-time investments that we can make that are going to put us on a lower cost trajectory going forward. So investments in a better system to manage all that inventory, right? Warehousing systems, better systems to manage our diversity and small business opportunities program. Those kinds of things. The one-time systems improvements that we can make that'll make us more efficient going forward. Those are the things that, at least as an agency head, that I've prioritized. I'm sure that the governor's office and the governor's budget office would have yet another perspective on how all that money should be spent. We're trying to focus on the stuff that we can control and the stuff that will help our business better serve our customers, who in turn, like our Department of Health, who has a ton of new money, quote unquote, new money right now that they need to spend on a relatively short time frame. in order to enhance things like the vaccine rollout here in PA. And there again, it's putting the genie back in the bottle in a creative way, right? It's working on an emergency procurement, because in my mind, the potential for federal funds to lapse at some point is a sufficient enough emergency for us to move quickly. But it's probably not a sufficient enough emergency for us to go up forward on a sole source basis. So it means we've got to figure out how to streamline the process for them and get a procurement done competitively and effectively within a timeline that still gives them time to spend the money.
Thank you all both for jumping into that conversation so quickly. Dustin, I know you have also seen some conversation going on with the ARPA funds around supply chain management infrastructure. What are you seeing from your perspective there?
Well, I mean, like Kirk said, a lot of folks, as they're dealing with one-time money, are trying to do things that meet the specific criteria of the grant, of which there's 3 or 4, I think there's actually probably 4 or 5 specific uses that are allowable under ARPA. But the subtext of all of those should be treat one-time money for one-time purposes. So I've seen people who are seeking to do infrastructure or facility upgrades, which can include trying to make improvements to the facilities so that they'll have long-lasting impact on the cost of utilities and the use. Kurt just had a good example about investing in some systems around inventory management so that we can make better connections. In ERP systems, their ERP systems will typically be dominated by finance, HR, and then procurement. But one of the submodules in there is aspects of supply chain, asset tracking, facilities, infrastructure. And we've seen more requests to do procurement market scans that would involve the ability to enhance the supply chain and the logistic capabilities of the systems and the ability to project. We did one assessment for a client that in some of the work that involves consumables like the fleet shops, the inventory systems on the fleet side were capable of doing min-max type of restocking, replenishing. So when things fall under X, then reorder. But if then it doesn't connect into the procurement system to be able to have an ongoing contract that's set up for that, it was having the effect of initiating procurement events for the line staff to go and replenish. And so it was somewhat efficient on the use side, but it was very inefficient on the procurement side in terms of connecting those two. And so building more of those connections between how our consumables are used and how we build replenishment cycles that are then further automated so that we don't send staff off on work that can be done by machines. That's a great point of investment.
Most definitely. I want to take us back quickly, and we're coming pretty close to the end of our hour, but I want to take us back to one of our polls that we executed at the beginning of the hour today. And it looked like from those on the call that their states were looking at changing their strategies around scenario planning, increasing communication, really looking at the public perception around cost. Jamie, and then maybe Kurt, how has your strategy changed in your own state around any of these components?
So I think communication is probably the number one focus that we're thinking about in responding to any sort of type of event in the future. Much like other states, it took us just a little while, right, to get the right people talking at the right time so that we could have the coordinated efforts. Maine is somewhat unique in that we don't have the hurricanes every other week that Florida and some of the southern states do. So we don't necessarily have that emergency management system that is operated on a global perspective in our state. However, we do a great job at, thinking about ice storms and thinking about blizzards, but I don't know that anyone in the world had ever experienced such supply chain disruption like we did during the pandemic. I mean, we've had disruptions before when it came to SARS and measles and Ebola and swine flu, but not to this extent. And God forbid it should ever happen again in the future. But the number one component that we're thinking about is communication. How do we put the right players in the room to have the right conversations at the right time? And then I think secondarily, more so, one of the drop downs on the poll was data. I don't know that the data is as important when you're in the middle of the emergency. The data is super important to help us plan for the emergency. So now that we're kind of coming out of that operating, like we have a fire right behind us, it is time to take that breath, look at the data that is provided as a result of the pandemic, to collaborate together to create the next plan. And I think that's part of working together with NASPO and NASCA and the National Governors Association and having these folks collaborate together. Procurement, I kind of call it like the water cooler of state government, where sort of everything flows into us because you can't really accomplish a whole lot without all these contractors and vendors. So I think, again, it's that important communication component that brings in internal and external stakeholders.
And Jamie, if I can have you expand just a little bit on that with the communication piece, how did you work with your own citizens of the state? We know trust in government is certainly something all of us work towards, but was there a connection with your communication to your constituents?
Open door policy, right? Come, tell me what you got. You want to change your business model? You want to start manufacturing, for example, ballot boxes in the middle of a pandemic when you normally make refrigerators? Great, let's do it. And that's exactly what happened. We did have a lot of collaboration with our Maine Municipal Association, for example, our Manufacturers Association, which trickled down to the small businesses who were trying to not close their doors, to just the citizens receiving the services, their child support checks, for example, tax checks. Those are all citizens that need the services of state government. And they responded by saying, government has to be open, government has to meet our needs. And the government did that. I think under our administration in the state, they were incredibly responsive to the citizens' needs. We tried hard not to skip a beat and make sure that they had what they needed, whether it be masks, whether it be sanitizer, vaccines. Right? The citizens of our state are why we are in the seats that we're in.
Absolutely. Kurt, additional thoughts around the public perception around those funds being spent and how Pennsylvania addressed that?
Well, I think I have a couple of thoughts. I think the first is that, we're, I don't think, and Jamie had mentioned this, right? We'd never experienced an emergency, anything quite like this in terms of its duration. And so the systems that we build for, a hurricane or a flood turned out not really to be adequate for what became an 18-month emergency that we had to manage our way through, and is still to some degree ongoing, right? So I would just absolutely agree with Jamie that the number one thing we're really focused on right now is communication, enhancing communication, collaborating. So I mentioned refreshing and managing that stockpile. Couldn't possibly do it without collaboration and without a commitment from not just our state agencies, but also our local government partners, others who use those consumables. We're going to need a commitment from them going forward to help us replenish that inventory. And so we're working through those plans now. I think, from a public trust perspective, it's just so important that we keep telling the story about how these people and these systems came through and delivered in our time during an extraordinarily difficult time. We're now kind of approaching sort of the Monday morning quarterback phase of all of this, right? Where depending on, you know, I mean, it's hard to keep politics out of public procurement as much as we want to. You know, so we've gotten a lot of inquiries about all of, you know, about our hand sanitizer. You know, everyone wants to point to that and say, well, you bought too much, or, you know, or if you ultimately have to toss it or dispose of it, you know, that's, someone will turn that into some kind of scandal, or they might try. And I think that the thing you've got to do is just keep telling, be open, and transparent, and keep telling the story about how we delivered. You know, this pandemic had an impact well beyond supply chain, right? Like every part of state government was affected and had to step up and deliver. So Pennsylvania had a 10-fold increase in the number of outbound unemployment checks that had to go out within a 3-week period. And my team of the other part of the department that prints all those checks, excuse me, handled that 10-fold volume increase and didn't miss a single deadline. You know, and so those are the stories that I just want to keep telling, because I think you know, we're working in an environment where folks, the general public, you know, doesn't trust the public sector in the manner that perhaps they ought to. And I think that the way we've managed to pull our states through a really, really challenging time creates an opportunity for us to really underscore that they really should. We should enjoy a higher level of trust than perhaps we do. I'll keep singing that song until I find a better one.
I appreciate that. I guess I really appreciate you talking about the use of stories. That messaging is so vital. I mean, that is how we make that connection, that personal connection with the citizens and the constituents. So Dustin, I know we're getting close on our time, but one of the things we haven't really talked about today is technology. And we know that there are a lot of conversations in the states around technology. What are some of those broad implications that we need to be thinking about when we consider technology around supply chain management?
Well, I mean, definitely when the Monday morning quarterbacking happens, one of the biggest wins out of, or the silver linings, I suppose, out of the period is automation of a lot of longstanding anachronisms within procurement. Right? I mean, the paper bids, blue ink signatures, notaries on 6 pages kind of things rapidly evaporated when there weren't people in the office to receive these. We saw an explosion of automation of the procurement function. We already talked about some of the fact that ARPA money may go in some cases to further linking procurement and supply chain. So that's a win, because if we want to attract the next generation of people into these spaces, we need to automate the work that doesn't really use someone's brain, and all it is having them move things from one place to another, and automate those functions, and then really make procurement and supply chain and government be a place where people can think and do system design and be creative, because that's what's going to get people to come. And you know, the tech was also critical for being able to put people into their virtual environment, which many shops are still in. And so those were big advancements in the tech. And since we've got 30 seconds left, I want to briefly congratulate Jamie Shore for her NASPO presidency. We all need to acknowledge that Jamie just was honored among her peers. So I'm glad to be on a panel with you today, my clubhouse friend. So thank you, Pam, for having us on.
Well, and thanks to all 3 of you. We certainly appreciate the relationship that we have with NASPO and the other strategic partners here at NASCA. It's just so beneficial when we're all singing from the same hymnal, working from the same script, and whatever, you know, comments you want to make about it, but just that relationship that we've got with our sister associations, to have an opportunity to have these types of conversations. It's so helpful to all of our members across the board. So let me thank Kurt and Jamie and Dustin for being here with us today. We host these events on a monthly basis to share information from the states, to learn from each other and start that conversation. This is definitely just the tip of the iceberg around the strategies and the approaches in each of the states. So stay with NASCA, learn more about supply chain management and the other top 10 priorities for our state chief administrators. We'll have a recording from today posted in NASCA's Knowledge Center at nasca.org here in the next few days. Thank you so much for being with us. Thanks again to all of our panelists for being here today. And we will talk to you all on our next Top 10 live event. We will see you all very, very soon.